something that we didn't even know about until a few years ago when we were looking for information about World War One and found a newspaper article about the 24th Infantry coming to Fort Niagara. So this opened a whole new door into something that wasn't previously known. So it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Ranger Roger Osorio, and we thank him very much for being with us this evening.
Well, certainly. Thank you all for having me. Excited to be here and actually dive into a little bit longer of a history of making sure everyone can hear. Can everyone hear me right? I just had a message, sorry. Dive into a little bit more of the history of the 24th Infantry. Interestingly enough, for the Buffalo Soldiers, the time period is actually more expansive than most people consider. So from 1866, when the first all-black regiments are formed, the regular U.S. Army, all the way until about the Korean War. That's about close to a 90-year period that these soldiers are active, serving in various locations, including Old Fort Niagara at a time, but you're talking about places in Hawaii, Alaska, the Philippines, military attachés in the Dominican Republic and Liberia and Haiti, and bouncing all over. I guess without further ado, if I get permission to share the screen, I have a presentation ready to kind of go through all this bit of history. Let's see for screen sharing. Share my screen. There's the button. All right. Perfect. Sweet. Okay, you see the screen. So today we're going to be going over the brief history of the 24th Infantry Regiment. Again, very gracious to be here and thank you all for having me. Again, my name is Ranger Roger Osorio. I'm here at the Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers National Monument over here in Wilberforce, Ohio. And starting off as well, it's always interesting to take a look back, especially at African-American history in the military in the United States. And before the Buffalo Soldiers, they were already serving. It's interestingly enough to say that African-Americans have served in every war since the American Revolution, since the United States became a country, or even beforehand as well. On the left-hand side, you do have actually a drawing of a soldier who served in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. They were the most famous regiment at the time, like coming from the state of Rhode Island, because they had African Americans serving them freely. In the middle, you do have a photograph of a man by the name of James Armistead Lafayette, and he was actually a spy. He worked closely with General Lafayette and General Washington, and he provided a lot of information that helped make the revolution a success. You also have the reality of, on the right-hand side as well, you have Charles Ball for the U.S. Navy, so back in the War of 1812. So you do see during these early time periods, you are having African-Americans serve during these time frames. Moving over into the time frame of the Civil War, you do have the creation of the United States Colored Troops. So that was like an installation of African-Americans to serve within the Army as well. And during that time period, you're having an influx of soldiers coming from these enslaved states, escaping slavery, making it to the North, enlisting into the Union Army to serve and fight, in a sense, for their freedom. During that time frame, as though you have the man on the right, his name is Gabriel Young. He was a father of Charles Young, who would later serve in the Army as an officer. But for him, very uniquely, because he served in the 5th Heavy Artillery Troops down south there in Vicksburg, but well after the fact. And then you also have other people like on the left as well. You have this influx of soldiers that even achieved great success during the Civil War. Now, with the success and the status of the Civil War, you do flow into the time period in which the Buffalo Soldiers are created. First things first, you're going to need a precedence to lead them. By the U.S. Army standards, they determined that Black soldiers were a success, but they were led always by white officers. So they do create 6 all-Black regiments as the new armies expanded after the Civil War. So you do have 2 cavalry units will be all-Black soldiers. You have the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and then you have 4 infantry units, the 38th, 39th, 40th, and 41st Infantry. Now the photographs of these gentlemen that you're seeing in front of you are of those original colonels, the people who were set in charge of these regiments when they're first created. And then most interestingly enough for this, in the context of the 24th Infantry, it would be the 40th Infantry as well as the 38th Infantry. And uh, from there, you are going to have the creation of this 24th Infantry. And even their histories are quite unique as well. You do have the 38th Infantry, famous for having a woman who served within them. You have Cathay Williams, who did enlist and serve in the 38th Infantry, made it all the way to out west when they were serving out west during the early stages of that American expansionism after the Civil War. And you have even the 41st Infantry as well. So they kind of combined into becoming the 24th Infantry in 1869. So on March 3rd, 1869, the Army does consolidate to kind of reduce what they're having in the sense of the size of the Army, given the realities and costs and everything. And when that happens as well, you're going to have the Buffalo Soldiers partaking in what's known as the Plains War. This is during the time period, during that American expansion, where we're moving out west. Settlers are coming out west as well, like to Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, to these territories. But in the mix of that, you have a conflict with the indigenous people who are already living there. Buffalo Soldiers often were partaking in traveling of, station wagons, trying to deliver mail, all these various tasks that helped with the assistance of settling out the West, but also protecting the construction of railroads, the construction of posts, and also the new Army force that are developing on the West. During that time frame as well, that's when the nickname comes about of Buffalo Soldiers, and it starts with early recorded history comes from this woman here. Her name is Frances M.A. Rose. She was the wife of an officer in the 3rd Infantry. So again, not a Buffalo Soldier regiment, but then at a time frame out west, they were stationed together while at Fort Sill, which is in the territory of, which is now Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma. And during that time frame, she often wrote letters during her time periods traveling with her husband to these different Army forts in the West. And that's where she wrote this quote here: "The Indians call them Buffalo Soldiers because of their wool heads. Wool-like heads are so much like the matted cushion that is between the horns of a buffalo." Interestingly enough, when she wrote this in June of 1872 at Camp Supply over in the Indian Territories, that's kind of what started off or kicked off this notion of the nickname Buffalo Soldiers. I always find that interesting because during this time period, we have no recollection or documentation of what they thought of the name, if it was seen as a positive light, whether it was seen as a positive nickname. Large intake of this because many of those first original soldiers who did serve in these regiments, all black regiments, were formerly enslaved. Due to the institution of slavery, they didn't have the skills to read and write or were forbidden to during that process. And then as they get into the Army, new developments are occurring where the Army is supplying them with teachers, chaplains to help teach them how to read and write so they can do other tasks as well that are associated with the Army. So interestingly enough, we don't have any true records of that time period, that early time period when this name comes about. It's always like to throw a little piece of cool history facts in there. Continue on with the 24th Infantry as well. During that time period, you're having these soldiers prove themselves during this time period of the Plains War. You are having a soldier by the name of Sergeant Benjamin Brown. He, on May 11th, on 1889, was serving with Company B of the 24th Infantry. And during a transport of some funds, they are actually attacked by wagon thieves. In the midst of that battle, by defending themselves against these bandits, he was shot several times, but still defending and trying to fight to protect not only the supply, but also protect his fellow soldiers. Another soldier who was there as well, who was there in this incursion, was Corporal Isaiah Mays, and he as well partook in this conflict. But for Isaiah Mays, he actually would crawl away to safety and would crawl about 2 miles while injured to get help for the soldiers at hand. For their actions, they were actually awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military award one can receive, and they both were serving again in the 24th Infantry. So you are seeing during this time period, yes, the 24th Infantry is being sent out west, being stationed between the Arizona territories, Oklahoma territories, New Mexico, Texas, and they're serving as very similar to the other Buffalo Soldiers serving as well. And these two in particular did achieve were awarded the highest honor by being awarded the Medal of Honors. After the time period of the Plain Wars does tend to slow about the 1890s, we're seeing more peaceful, more settled areas as well out west, and the conflicts kind of starting to peter out. During that time frame as well, you are having the Buffalo Soldiers, especially the 24th Infantry, being stationed in various duty stations. Here you actually have a photograph of when they were stationed out in Salt Lake City. And during these different time periods, they were stationed at the various forts, such as Fort McCavitt in Texas, Fort Davis in Texas, Fort Grant in Arizona, Fort Thomas in Arizona, Fort Apache in New Mexico. Here you see them in right outside of Salt Lake City. So they're kind of just being stationed around, but still kind of supplying that peaceful transition as the Americans are more settling into the West. And then you have this huge influx of soldiers by 1897 or so, where things are kind of getting more settled down. During this photograph here, you do see that they're settled at Fort Douglas in Utah, so like near Salt Lake City, and the communities themselves are becoming more aware and of the soldiers being there as well. In certain cases, there were often conflicts. Interestingly enough, for here in Salt Lake City with the 24th Infantry, at first there was a lot of hesitation with their presence being there due to the like racist sentiment that was happening during the time frame. But as the soldiers did settle into the communities, you do see the start of bridging these gaps. A year later, the newspapers of the area would actually publish an apology letter, interestingly enough, kind of like apologizing to the soldiers and like acknowledging how respectful and how great it was to have them there. So a little more history into the context of this photo. This is actually at the start of the Spanish-American War, as the 24th Infantry is being relocated to Tampa, Florida, to then be shipped off to Cuba during that war. And this is a huge parade that the city themselves threw, kind of celebrating the soldiers' presence there. As we said, for the 24th Infantry, the Spanish-American War, they did partake in it. Here's an actual cool photograph of them embarking in Tampa, Florida, as they prepared to go to Cuba. As they left the Salt Lake City, they did station for a while at Chimagacua Park over in Georgia, and then moved on to Tampa as they prepared to make their way to Cuba. And the cool thing is, too, as well, during this time frame, we do actually have a historic video, which I'll play real quick to make sure this works. We can actually see the Buffalo Soldiers themselves. Oh, let me see if I can play it again. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, the video's not working. We'll try it again. There's another video too. Hopefully that one works. But again, to their exports in Cuba, they do partake in the Battle of San Juan Hill, the infamous Rough Riders, as you see with Theodore Roosevelt here. 24th Infantry was there as well, which I always find intriguing with these time periods of history, because if you just take that same photograph but kind of zoom out, you can actually see the African American soldiers on the side. Oftentimes it's that zoomed up image, so you can really see at the time Colonel Roosevelt's image there with the Rough Riders. But if you look around this photograph as well, for the whole picture, Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry and 24th Infantry are spread throughout this photo as well. And then their services in Cuba doesn't just end there. After that big battles, especially in the beginning of July, they actually are sent to Siboney in Cuba. So during this area, this was kind of like the medical departments in seek of care. Many of the soldiers, yes, they were being injured in the conflicts of war, but one of the biggest conflict or issues they were facing during this time period was disease. High rates of yellow fever coming from the malaria as well, from the water and also the mosquitoes. And the 24th Infantry was actually stationed in Siboney, Cuba, to help with the medical department. So they were caring for the sick soldiers. A lot of this also came from, interestingly enough, this perception that African Americans were less susceptible to tropical diseases, which proved to be false. About 24 out of 456 men during that time period when they were assisting with the medical department did not get sick. So you have, again, over 400 of these soldiers fell ill. And of those over 400 that fell ill, 30 of them died from the diseases. And then after that, they were departed back to Cuba, from Cuba, and quarantined over at Camp Wickoff over in New York on Long Island. And they're there for a time period as well. And immediately following the Spanish-American War, you do have the, and again, here's another photograph of the soldiers as well. You do have the kind of the start of the Philippine-American War. This one's more unique in the sense that it was fought within the Philippines. You do see kind of a change in the uniform, becoming more of this tan, lighter uniform there. From the immediacy, the 24th Infantry did partake in several conflicts and skirmishes, fighting against, again, the Filipino people as well. And here, hopefully this one plays as well. Let's see. I'm sorry, the videos aren't working. All right, but if you ever get curious too, so both videos that I tried playing, they're on the Library of Congress. We do see the Buffalo Soldiers of the 24th Infantry disembarking in Cuba, and the other video is them walking while in the Philippines. Sorry, technical difficulties, my apologies. But here we have a photograph of Ida B. Wells, and what's very unique about this time period as well, with them being in the Philippines, is you're having this influx of, back in America, African-American writers and activists as well, kind of being against what we're doing as the United States, kind of oppressing, in a sense, people of color. And Ida B. Wells famously wrote this article in which she entitled "End the War in the Philippines." She was kind of calling for the colored Americans is for expansion, but he wants expansion on lines consistent with the human principles, for the establishment of which he has given his labor and shed his blood in 4 wars. Again, kind of reiterating how African Americans have been serving in these conflicts, but then still facing great discrimination back at home. You are having kind of this kind of conflict of thought as well, even within the soldiers. And famously, during this time period from 1866 up to this point, the Buffalo Soldier regiments, these all-black regiments, were noted for having very low desertion rates, very low kind of conflicts or conflicts within them, like kind of deserting, things like that. Until here, you have the period, you do have a person who did serve in the 24th Infantry by the name of David Fagan. Now, he was a private in the 24th Infantry, and his reasons for doing so aren't well documented, in the sense that because he was deserted, kind of joined into the Filipino army, fighting against Americans, which is a very unique time in history, because then now you're seeing this kind of flip of an American soldier flipping to the other side and battling against Americans. The U.S. forces did put up bounties on his head, put up everything they did to try and fight him. And he proved to be a very fightful captain and battling against the American forces, because he knew them from serving in the 24th Infantry. Eventually, he was captured and killed and turned in by the Filipino soldiers, kind of in the sense of a traitor's death. That part of the period was kind of very interesting, seeing how that dichotomy of thought was happening. Interesting enough, though, we do have another 24th Infantry soldier who did serve while in the Philippines, kind of in a different light as well. And his name was Private Walter Loving. Interestingly, Private Walter Loving served from like 1893 to about 1898 in the 24th Infantry. During the time period of the Philippine-American War, he did earn a commission in the 48th Volunteer Infantry, so not a part of the regular army, but he was more into the music, and he has huge musical talents and served in the regimental band. During his service in the regimental band, and then his transfer into the working in the Philippines, after the war, following the war, he would actually serve as the Philippine Constabulary band leader. So he's kind of putting together the music ensemble of the military that's in the Philippines after the war. And famously in 1909, he would actually lead that band, that foreign band, during the presidential inauguration of William Howard Taft, who did serve in the Philippines during that time frame as well. So it's kind of interesting, like the first ever non-American band to welcome a president as the new president of the United States was led by a soldier from the 24th Infantry. Kind continue on this time frame as well. Not the entire 24th Infantry did serve in the Philippines during that time frame. In 1899, you also have Company L of the 24th Infantry serve in Alaska. They were stationed there, kind of stationed out of Fort Vancouver, but due to extreme winters and weather, they moved over to the Vancouver barracks and kind of replacing the 14th Infantry who was stationed there, and then stationed in Skagway, Alaska. During that time frame, they became more connected with the community as well. You kind of see them here in practice or during practice marches, and they kind of maintained order in these gold rush towns. A huge thing with the gold rush towns, especially across the U.S.-Canada border, you're having this huge influx of people coming to these areas to get rich quick in a sense of collecting gold, the good old famous gold rush era. But with that can arise conflicts, so the military was there to just keep the peace. Not only did Company L kind of keep the peace there, they also kind of built these roads within the communities themselves. They were often playing sports such as baseball against like the local mining teams, really creating these inroads of relationships with the people in these communities. And then after a while as well, they served in another famous area, good old Yosemite National Park. Here's a photograph of some of the soldiers who were serving while in Yosemite. This photo is fairly famous, especially because, yes, they're in Yosemite, they're on horseback, but these are the members of the 24th Infantry. They were stationed there, about 500 or so Buffalo soldiers served in Yosemite during the time periods between 1899 and 1910. So oftentimes during the summer months, the military was still taking care of the national parks before the National Park Service existed until 1916, so several years later. And what they were doing in these national parks and these public lands was, protecting it from poachers, protecting it from timber thieves, people who were going down, cutting all these trees down, extinguishing forest fires, and also protecting the wildlife as well, and protecting the landscapes from like sheep herders who were like just eating away the landscape. So in a sense, being those first kind of original park rangers, all the military officers were kind of doing these duties during that time. And then during that time period of peace, we're not really at war yet. Oftentimes they're back into garrison duty. Again, this is that time period between 1902 and 1917 where we're seeing them stationed at these various forts. For time frames, they're stationed and garrisoned over in the Philippines again. During this time frame is when they are stationed at Fort Niagara. Another scope of them are stationed in Brooklyn, in Schenectady, in Albany, in all that in New York, as well as being stationed in the Presidio in California, San Francisco, and even Fort D.A. Russell over in Wyoming. They're often performing garrison duties, so like a lot of repairs to these olden sites, especially kind of maintaining and upgrading them, because as technologies are changing, we're deciding to get away from these old forts. So you're seeing a lot of the older forts kind of be consolidated and abandoned, but then these stationary forts that are going to be used during that time period moving forward are being kind of readied and prepared. Another soldier who served during this time frame in the 24th Infantry is Lieutenant Colonel Alan Allensworth. So he was a chaplain in the 24th Infantry, and even back in the Civil War, he did serve in the Navy, part of the Union Army, and he was appointed as a chaplain by President Grover Cleveland back in 1886. So he did serve with the 24th Infantry during this entire time frame. He was actually one of the ones who helped establish the huge the education system that I was speaking of earlier, because you're having these chaplains kind of educate this massive soldiers who were many coming from that enslaved time period. And with him and his help, they really established kind of the guidelines of what the Army education can be. And this was expanded to not only the soldiers, but also the children of the soldiers or the children of the officers, kind of creating these schools of where the soldiers are learning as well. He would eventually retire in 1906 and settle into California, where he and a couple other investors and other African-American citizens would actually establish the town of Allensworth, California, which is now today Allensworth State Park, which is pretty cool. Another famous African-American soldier who served in the 24th Infantry during this time was Wilber Bullet Joe Rogan. So Bullet Rogan, as he was famously called, was a pitcher in the Negro Leagues. Another huge thing that was happening in this time frame is sports is becoming more profound and more well known, especially played across the country. And interestingly enough, you're having a lot of these soldiers also serve, who serve, played in the Negro Leagues in these sports, serving in the military as well. And he would enlist in the 25th Infantry in 1915, he would serve in 24th Infantry from 1911 to 1914 during that time period, and he was honorably discharged. He would later re-enlist with the 25th Infantry for a time frame and play on their baseball team. During this time frame as well, and as we're getting into the 1916 era, 1916, the 24th Infantry is sent down during the punitive expeditions to Mexico. So again, we're seeing them getting moved once again as we're getting into this new battle, trying to capture the Pancho Villa. So Pancho Villa led a raid in New Mexico at Camp Furlong, and because of that, the United States wanted to go back and capture him. And in July 1st, 1916, the 24th Infantry reported to Dublin, Mexico. Here's actually a photo of the encampment they had down there. You can see some of the soldiers spread around. And after the punitive wars, we're entering now World War I. And during World War I, we are having the 24th Infantry still stationed in that the US-Mexico border. So they are now stationed in Camp Furlong in Columbus, New Mexico. And for a time period, they're serving alongside that border until the area is decommissioned and they're moved elsewhere. Eventually, they were moved over to Camp Logan. The 24th Infantry is moved over to Houston, Texas. And that's where you have an infamous situation happen of the situation at Camp Logan. Here, you're going to have conflicts arise again with the local population. In a sense, the racist rhetorics and all these things going against the soldiers. And the soldiers of the 24th Infantry, you can have Corporal Charles W. Baltimore. He was actually beaten by the Houston police. And in response, you're having about several soldiers retaliate against this because they are soldiers of the Federal Army. And that led to this huge trial that happened here. By the end of this trial, they did, in a sense, court-martial like tens of soldiers. 19 soldiers were actually put to death at the end of this trial, and 50 soldiers were sentenced to life in prison. It was a huge press event, especially in the cusp of World War I, which kind of shows that race relation that's happening as well. A lot of the times, especially for during this period, you're seeing these race relations and kind of what's happening across the spectrum really get into these bigger conflicts. And then after the Camp Logan affairs, Buffalo soldiers still served during World War I. Some soldiers who served in the 24th Infantry would actually gain commissions in the newer regiments that were forming as well, like this gentleman here. His name is Captain Aaron R. Fisher. And Captain Aaron R. Fisher was serving with the first served with the 9th Cavalry back in 1911, and eventually would serve with the 366 during World War I, sorry. And he graduated from the Officer Candidate Schools over in Fort Des Moines, Iowa. And then after the war, because the infantry was expanded upon, but then reshrank to the regular army, he would serve then with the 24th Infantry. So you are seeing these soldiers who are now gaining these, who did serve overseas during World War I, come back and serve into the 24th Infantry. And he would serve with the 24th Infantry until his retirement in 1947. And during his time over with the 366 during World War I, he would receive the Purple Heart and also as the French Croix de Guerre and a Gold Star. And it's during this time period of World War I, you are seeing that buffalo patch kind of come about once again. And this is when you're seeing more of an ownership of this name. So interestingly, as we said, back in 1870s, we have that first instance of the Buffalo Soldier name come about. But during the course of World War I is when you start seeing the African-American regiments, even the 92nd Division, take ownership of that name, calling themselves the Buffalo Soldiers Division. And again, this name's again placated towards all the all-black units, including like the 9th, 10th, 24th, and 25th Infantry. These original regiments that they're kind of honoring with this name now. After World War One, again, you are seeing again Lieutenant Benjamin O. Davis Jr. He would actually become the fourth African American to graduate from West Point, the son of Benjamin O. Davis Sr., who would go on to become the first African American to reach the rank of general. And when he graduated in West Point in 1936, he would be the last graduate from him was in 1889, which is Charles Young. And when he was commissioned the second lieutenant in the 24th Infantry. Now, famously, he would go off and serve with what would later become the Tuskegee Airmen and become the commander of with the Army Air Corps in 1941. And then during that time period as well, we're now transitioning into World War II. During World War II, the 24th Infantry was stationed at Fort Benning, kind of the infantry school there. But then as the war was conflicting in Europe and as well as over in the Pacific, the 24th Infantry would be stationed in the Pacific during World War II. So they would depart from San Francisco and be stationed over in the New Herbie Islands. This is an actual photograph of that time period as well. In the sense of combat, they were battling into the first African American infantry unit to be engaged in combat during the war. They would serve over in the Northern Solomon Islands and in the Admiralty Islands as well on New Guinea. The 25th Infantry consistently would serve as, just like all the other regiments during this time frame. Yes, you're seeing these African American soldiers placated into these areas, but also attesting to their combat readiness. Often, even from the start of the Buffalo Soldier time period in 1866, they're consistently proving that when they're told to accomplish a task, they're doing so. And they were there all the way until the Empire of Japan would surrender. And at the end of the war, they would take the surrendering forces and then be stationed in Japan itself. And they would serve there as an occupying force for a time period in Okinawa, Japan. And it's during this time period as well, while they're in Japan, and they would stay there even following the war, that President Truman presented that executive order desegregating the military on July 28, 1948. However, the 24th Infantry still remained as is, as being an all-black regiment, and part of the 25th Infantry Division. Then a couple years later, as the conflicts arose again in Korea, the 24th Infantry would partake in this war as well. Though the military was desegregated 2 years ago, they're still occupied because they were serving as an occupying force, and then as they were sent as the closest ones to Korea, that regiment was never disbanded, so they were still serving as an all-black regiment. And in June 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea, 25th Infantry was immediately deployed into South Korea. During this time frame as well, you're having two huge names come out of this time period as well. First off is going to be Private William H. Thompson. Private William H. Thompson was serving with the 24th Infantry since 1945. And during the Battle of Sanju, Private Thompson was wounded and opted to continue taking cover fire so the rest of the regiment, the unit can retreat. For his actions, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, kind of putting himself in that place to be a target and allowing so many of his other soldiers to be able to retreat to safety. In another incident as well, in June 2nd, 1951, so again, the early onsets of the Korean War, you're having Sergeant Cornelius H. Charlton as well. And he was a part of Operation Pile Driver, which was an attack on Hill 543 during the Korean War. And he distinguished himself by conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action against the enemy. His platoon was attacked heavily and defended against hostile positions. For his actions, again, you're having this honor being bestowed into the 24th Infantry as well. And for his actions, he was awarded the Medal of Honor once again. Oh, not once again, but he was awarded the Medal of Honor. And in October 1st, 1951, the call does come in to not only replace the 25th Infantry, but to fully deactivate it. The call comes into on September 22nd, 1951, that they're going to be replaced with the 14th Infantry Regiment. But then once they're replaced, they're set to be deactivated and decommissioned. So at this point, we're seeing the final all-black regiment be desegregated, but also deactivated. And it's during this time period we kind of like have a full reflection onto the course of the 24th Infantry, serving from 1869 to this 1951 time period into the Korean War. We're seeing that we're having several 4 Medal of Honor winners. We have infamous people who became Baseball Hall of Famers, went on to be Tuskegee Airmen, and a whole influx of hundreds and hundreds of soldiers who served during this time period, and all serving in the sense of bettering not only themselves, but in the country they live in. Many of the soldiers during this entire time period often chose to serve in the military because it offered a great opportunity for them to serve, make a steady income, and supply that back for their families, and even gaining skills as they moved west and even settling out there as well. Like the story of Lieutenant Colonel Alan Allensworth, once he retired from the Army, he settled and had a homestead and developed his own city out in California. You're seeing kind of this influx of soldiers gain from the military experience and go back home. Sadly, during the time frame as well, they are still dealing with the racist repercussions depending where they're living from, as we see kind of what happens with Camp Logan during the Houston riots down in Texas while the soldiers are still serving. But ultimately, the soldiers, once their 24th Infantry is disbanded, now we're looking at a new era of the military, one that is desegregated and one that we now have today. I know that was a lot of information. I know for me, dissecting it was a lot. I would love to open up this point of the presentation up to questions. If you want to hear any extra highlights or any other kind of pivotal points or moments in time during the course of that 90-year period in which this regiment existed.
If you have your any questions, you can unmute yourself or put up your hand. You might want to stop screen sharing, Roger.
Yep. Gotcha. There it is. Awesome. Yeah.
Hi there. I had one quick question about the experience of these soldiers returning back from the services.
Yep.
I'm part of the interpretive staff. I studied philosophy and African American studies in particular as a minor at university. So having studied that, we went a lot into the experience of World War II vets coming back from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and how that informed their experience in, say, the Black Panther Party or the Black Liberation Army later in the 70s. And I'm curious if you can draw any links to maybe the Black Freedom Movement overall based off the 24th experiences in Cuba or abroad.
Coming out the gate hot. I love it. Yeah.
Apologies. I'm known for that.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I think it's easier to pinpoint it exactly. Like in short, it did have an effect. Like you are seeing, for instance, from 1866 when the Buffalo Soldiers, like those first all-black regiments are made official in the regular army. As we said, like in the beginning of the presentation, African Americans have served in every American war ever. But not until 1866, they're part of the regular army. What that means is basically once the volunteer army is done, you're out of the army, no retirement, no career, that's it. Now you're having this transition where they're doing so, but now they're being sent to these various places. And oftentimes, like as we discussed, like for the 24th Infantry, they're being sent to locations, oftentimes the first ones there to reestablish these camps that were abandoned maybe during the Civil War, to reestablish them, and even after that period of the Plains War to reestablish them. They're experiencing these places out west, and I think one unique thing that happens, especially with the Buffalo Soldier Regiment, they are serving that dichotomy of thought, right? We're people of color who are being oppressed, being sent off to, in a sense, oppress other people of color. But in the reality, what they actually did, oftentimes when you look at these huge massacres like Sand Creek Massacre or the issues with the ghost dance period that happens later towards the end of the Plains War period, they're not involved in these giant massacres. Oftentimes, where you're seeing these instances where they're winning the Medal of Honor or being part of these battles, a lot of it's self-defense. Or, like for example, sorry, flipping through pages. With Corporal Isaiah Mays and Sergeant Benjamin Brown, it was bandits who attacked the wagon that they were transporting. Right? These weren't just like standard. These were bandits, and they defended that as well. And even too with the Indian territories, oftentimes you're still having white settlers kind of trying to move into that area that was deemed Native American lands. And the Buffalo Soldiers are used to escort these and arrest these people and escort them off the land. So it's kind of this two dichotomy of thought. And then also, as they're going off to these other places and overseas, sometimes, like in some cases, the soldiers themselves were retired overseas. When their time was up in the military, they served for 3 years or 5 years. When that time period was over, wherever they were, that was it. Oftentimes they re-enlisted, but other times they said, oh, well, that's it. And then, like, for example, during the Philippine-American War, you do have some soldiers that are documented to just, they ended their enlistment came to terms, and then they just retired and said, I'm going to stay in the Philippines. Walter Loving famously, because like when he started serving with the Philippine Constabulary Band, he then settled for a time period in the Philippines. Like after his time period as an American soldier was over, his enlistment was over. So you're kind of seeing those trains of thoughts kind of transition to I'll be here. But even doing so, when they go back home or go back to these other areas, they are bringing these trains of thoughts, this income, this experience, and transferring that to the other people around them as well. It gets trickier in the sense of like direct examples of what soldiers, because you're talking about thousands of soldiers. One great example, I guess to wrap up this longer answer, I'd give the example of Brigadier General Charles Young. So he famously served as like the first African-American officer to reach the rank of colonel. And though he was spent his entire adult life working within the military as an officer, he was great friends with W.B. Du Bois and great friends with Paul Laurence Dunbar and great friends with Booker T. Washington. And as they're starting what would become the NAACP, they're often reaching out to him saying, hey, you should join us. And he's like, I'm in the military. So it's like those levels also of transition that are happening, he's being supportive. So even when Carter G. Woodson is starting what would become the studies that become Black History Week into Black History Month, as an officer, he's sending money, his own money, to support that cause. He himself is in a predicament where, as an Army officer, he has his rules and regulations. He can't just go show up. But there are other ways in which they're supporting. I hope that answers the question. But
yeah, absolutely incredible. And you actually nipped another question of mine in the bud immediately, which is how these Black soldiers in the United States Army, given especially the recent American Civil War, experienced and thought about the colonization of native lands out west. So thank you for that. This was an incredible presentation and incredibly done. Thank you.
Thank you. No problem.
Anybody else? Well, thank you, Roger. Bob, it's up to you.
Well, I'd like to thank Roger for being with us tonight. We've been corresponding over a period of a couple of months, and this was just great. We do appreciate you being here and filling us in on the larger history of the 24th. Our next presentation will be on March 30th, again at 7:30. It's a presentation for Women's History Month, and it's called Don't Cry Over Spilt Rum. And it's looking at women working with the British Army, the British military during the 18th century. So please be with us for that. Registration for that program will be up on our website around March 1st. So once again, Roger, thank you so much for being with us. Excellent presentation. We learned a lot.
Yeah, for sure. And also too, here, I'll throw my email in the chat real quick. If you ever have any other questions or ideas and things like that, feel free to reach out or for more clarification. I know that was a lot of history in about 40 minutes. But my email is there. Definitely feel free to contact us. if you're ever interested in any other programs about the Buffalo Soldiers as well. I do know we're constantly even growing as a park. We're celebrating our 10th year anniversary this actual March as being a part of the National Park Service. But most definitely, we're always here as a resource and support, and happy to share any pieces of history for the Buffalo Soldiers.
Hey, Roger, one suggestion somebody made, if you could post the videos that you couldn't show, if you have, do you happen to have links to them? You could post them in the chat as well.
Okay.
That would be fantastic. And we'll make those links available as well.
Well, once again, thanks everyone for being with us tonight. Wish everyone a good evening.